When most people think of ancient Greece, they imagine beauty. They think of white marble statues. They think of wise philosophers like Socrates and Plato. They think of democracy, theater, and the Olympic Games. Ancient Greece is often described as the birthplace of Western civilization, but history is never only light. Behind the statues and temples, behind the poetry and philosophy, there were rituals that later generations felt uncomfortable talking about. Some were secret, some were intense, some were deeply personal, and some were slowly erased from history. To understand these rituals, we must first understand how important religion was in ancient Greece. Religion was not separate from daily life. It was part of everything. Every city had its own gods. Every home had small shrines. Every major decision, war, marriage, travel, involved prayer or sacrifice. The Greeks believed their gods were powerful, emotional, and deeply involved in human life. These gods were not perfect. They felt jealousy, anger, love, and desire. And because their gods were human-like, their worship sometimes reflected human instincts. There were public festivals where everyone could gather. There were parades, music, food, and sacrifices of animals. These events were organized and controlled, but there were also rituals that were not public, rituals that only certain people could join, rituals that required secrecy. One of the most famous of these was known as the Eleusinian mysteries. For almost 2,000 years, people traveled to a small town called Eleusis, near Athens. They came from different cities, even from outside Greece. What happened there was secret. Participants were sworn to silence. If someone revealed what they saw, they could face death. That alone tells us something important. When historians look at records, they find almost no detailed descriptions of the ritual itself. Even writers who lived at the time refused to describe it fully. But we know this. The ritual was connected to the story of Demeter and Persephone, a story about loss, death, and rebirth. Scholars believe participants went through a powerful emotional experience. It may have involved symbolic acts, representing death and renewal. It may have involved sacred objects shown in darkness. It likely involved intense feelings, meant to change how a person saw life and death. Some modern historians believe certain plants or drinks were used to create altered states of mind. Others believe the experience was purely emotional and symbolic. Whatever happened inside those ceremonies was strong enough that people described it as life-changing. Why would something so powerful later be hidden? Because later cultures, especially during the rise of Christianity, viewed these pagan rituals as dangerous or immoral. But the Eleusinian mysteries were only one part of a larger pattern. Another set of rituals shocked even ancient writers. These were the rites of Dionysus. Dionysus was the god of wine, madness, ecstasy, and freedom. His worship was very different from common temple ceremonies. His followers, known as Bacchae, or Maenads, gathered in forests and mountains. They danced wildly. They drank wine. They entered trance-like states. Ancient texts describe moments of extreme emotional release. Some stories claim followers tore apart animals with their hands during ritual madness. Some scholars believe these stories were exaggerated to frighten outsiders. But what is clear is that Dionysian rituals allowed people, especially women, to step outside normal social rules. In everyday Greek society, women had limited public power. But during these rituals, they could express emotion freely. They could shout, dance, and move without restraint. To some leaders, that was dangerous. Religious ecstasy breaks control. When people feel connected to something beyond society, they stop fearing authority. That is one reason some rulers tried to limit or regulate these rituals. As Greek society developed, philosophers like Plato began promoting ideas of reason and self-control. Excess emotion was seen as weakness. Wild religious rituals did not match the image of a rational civilization. Over time, parts of these practices were softened, controlled, or hidden. But intimate rituals were not limited to Dionysus. Many fertility ceremonies existed across Greek cities. These rituals were connected to agriculture and survival. If crops failed, people starved. So fertility, both human and land fertility, was sacred. Symbols of reproduction were common in temples. Some ceremonies involved symbolic acts meant to encourage the gods to bless the land. To modern viewers, These symbols may seem shocking, but to ancient Greeks, they were practical. Life depended on growth and birth. In some regions, sacred sexuality was part of religious life. Certain temples had priestesses who represented goddesses of love and fertility. Their role was complex and often misunderstood by later writers. Not all stories about these practices are fully proven. Some were exaggerated by enemies. Some were misunderstood by later historians. But what we do know is that ancient religion was not always quiet or modest. It was emotional. It was physical. It was deeply connected to human instinct. As centuries passed, new powers rose. First came the Romans, who adopted many Greek gods, but reshaped their worship. Later came Christianity, which rejected pagan rituals completely. Temples were closed. Mystery religions were banned. Sacred sites were destroyed or turned into churches. When Christianity became dominant, many ancient texts were copied by Christian monks. But monks did not preserve everything equally. Texts that seemed immoral or dangerous were sometimes ignored. Slowly, certain rituals disappeared from written history. What remained was a cleaner version of Greece, a version focused on philosophy, art, and democracy. But beneath that polished image was a more complicated spiritual world. A world where humans tried to connect with the divine through powerful experiences. A world where emotion and instinct were not always controlled. And a world that later generations decided was too uncomfortable to remember fully. This is only the beginning. In part those, we will explore deeper into sacred intimacy, temple priestesses, Spartan coming-of-age rituals, and the political reasons these ceremonies were later erased. To understand these hidden rituals, we must talk about women. In many Greek city-states, women had limited public power. They could not vote. They could not speak in political meetings. Their lives were mostly inside the home, but religion was different. In religion, women had power. Some of the most important rituals in Greece were led by women. One example is the Thesmophoria, a festival held in honor of Demeter. Only married women could attend. Men were not allowed to watch or even ask questions. For 3 days, women gathered together away from the city. They fasted, they prayed, they performed secret ceremonies. Ancient writers later admitted that they did not know what truly happened during those days. What we do know is this: these rituals were about fertility, both for the land and for human families. Women played a central role in keeping the cycle of life moving. But later historians, mostly men, wrote very little about what women actually did in these ceremonies. Why? Because female religious power did not fit the later image of Greece as a place of reason and philosophy. So many details were ignored. This silence tells us something important. It shows that history is not only about what is written, it is also about what is left out. The cult of Dionysus, ecstasy, and fear. Now we move to one of the most misunderstood ritual traditions in ancient Greece, the worship of Dionysus was the god of wine, theater, and ecstasy. But he was also the god of madness and wild nature. His followers believed that through intense ritual, they could leave normal life behind and connect with something deeper. These ceremonies were not calm or quiet. They involved music, dancing, singing, and sometimes extreme emotional release. Women called Maenads were said to enter a state of divine frenzy. Some ancient sources claim that animals were torn apart during these rituals. It is hard to know how much of this is fact and how much is exaggeration. Greek writers themselves often describe these events with fear. Why? Because Dionysian rituals broke social rules. Women left their homes. People shouted instead of speaking calmly. Order turned into chaos. Later Roman writers criticized these rituals heavily. They called them dangerous and immoral. Eventually, some Dionysian practices were restricted or banned in certain areas, but they did not disappear. They survived in secret. The fear of these rituals tells us something important. Greek society valued control. Dionysian worship celebrated losing control. That tension made people uncomfortable. And what makes people uncomfortable is often erased from official history. Sacred sexuality in ancient Greece. Now we come to a topic that many modern writers avoid. Sacred sexuality. In some ancient Greek traditions, Sexuality was not seen as shameful. It was part of religious life. Certain festivals honored fertility gods through symbolic acts that represented creation and renewal. These acts were not hidden in shame. They were public symbols of life itself. In Corinth, for example, the temple of Aphrodite was said to include sacred attendants who served the goddess. Ancient historians debate how this system worked. Some describe it as sacred prostitution. Others believe this was an exaggeration by later writers. What matters is this: sexuality had a religious meaning. It was connected to growth, crops, children, and the survival of the community. Later, Christian writers strongly condemned these practices. They labeled them immoral and sinful. As Christianity became dominant in Europe, many older pagan traditions were rewritten or described in the worst possible way. Sacred rituals became corruption. Fertility symbols became shameful. This is how memory changes. Over time, the complex spiritual meaning behind these rituals was forgotten. Only scandal remained. Perhaps the most powerful secret ritual in ancient Greece was the Eleusinian mysteries. These ceremonies were held near Athens in honor of Demeter and Persephone. They lasted for nearly 2,000 years. Thousands of people were initiated, and yet no one ever wrote down the full ritual. Even today, historians do not know exactly what happened inside the final ceremony hall. Initiates swore an oath of silence. Breaking it could lead to death. We know that participants went through a journey. It involved fasting, walking, and symbolic actions connected to death and rebirth. Many ancient writers said that the experience changed them forever. They believed it removed the fear of death. That is powerful. Imagine a ritual so meaningful that people kept its secrets for centuries. Why did this survive for so long? Because it gave people hope. But when Christianity became the main religion of the Roman Empire, the Eleusinian mysteries were closed. The temple was destroyed. The secret ended, or perhaps it simply faded into silence. What we see here is not just a ritual. We see the ending of an entire spiritual world. Blood, sacrifice, and the question of violence. Many people ask, did ancient Greece practice human sacrifice? The answer is complicated. In mythology, we hear stories of children offered to gods. For example, the story of Iphigenia tells of a young girl prepared for sacrifice before the Trojan War. But myth is not always history. Archaeologists have found very little clear evidence of regular human sacrifice in classical Greece. Animal sacrifice, however, was common. Animals were killed in religious ceremonies. Their blood was offered to the gods. Their meat was shared in community feasts. For Greeks, this was not seen as cruel. It was a sacred act, connecting humans and gods. But later generations often felt uneasy about these practices. As moral systems changed, older rituals seemed harsh or primitive. Over time, violence in religion became something people wanted to forget. And so, stories were softened. Some rituals were described as symbolic instead of literal. Again, history was cleaned. Why ancient Greece tried to forget? Now we must ask the final question. Did ancient Greece really try to erase these rituals? In truth, it was not only Greece. Every civilization edits its past. As society changes, people look back and feel uncomfortable with older beliefs. They choose what to remember and what to ignore. In Greece, philosophy grew stronger. Thinkers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle promoted reason and logic. They valued debate and critical thinking. This created a new image of Greek culture, a culture of rational thought. Mystery rituals, wild dances, sacred sexuality, and emotional frenzy did not fit that image. So they became less central. Later, when Christianity became dominant, the shift was even stronger. Pagan rituals were described as dark or immoral. Temples were closed. Priests were silenced. Over centuries, what remained was a simplified version of Greece. A clean version. A version of marble statues and wise philosophers. But underneath that polished image was something more human. Something emotional. Something intimate. What these rituals really tell us when we look at these forgotten rituals, we see something important. Ancient Greece was not only the land of logic, It was also the land of deep emotion. People feared death. They hoped for rebirth. They celebrated fertility. They searched for meaning. They used music, dance, silence, and symbols to understand the world. They were human, and that is the key. The rituals were not horrifying because they were evil. They feel horrifying today because they are different from our modern comfort. They remind us that history is not clean. It is messy. It is alive. Another intimate ritual world that often makes modern readers uncomfortable is the world of oracles. In ancient Greece, people believed the gods could speak through chosen individuals. The most famous example was the Oracle of Delphi. People traveled from far away to ask questions about war, love, marriage, and death. The priestess, known as the Pythia, would enter a trance. Ancient writers describe her sitting above a sacred opening in the earth. Some believed vapors rose from below. Others believed the trance came from deep prayer and ritual preparation. What matters is not the exact method. What matters is this: people shared their deepest fears and secrets in these sacred spaces. Imagine standing before a priestess and confessing your worries about your family or your future. Imagine asking whether your child would survive, whether your city would fall, or whether you would die in battle. These were intimate moments. They were not political speeches. They were personal. Over time, later writers tried to explain the oracle in simple ways. Some said it was trickery. Some said it was madness. Some reduced it to superstition. But for the people who lived then, the oracle was real. It gave direction in a world full of danger. The modern world often prefers logic over mystery. Because of that, the emotional and spiritual power of the oracle is often ignored. But in ancient Greece, this was one of the most sacred connections between humans and the divine. Initiation and the fear of death. Many ancient Greek rituals centered on one powerful fear: death. Life in the ancient world was fragile. Disease, war, childbirth, and hunger could end a life quickly. People did not have modern medicine. They did not have long life expectancy, so they searched for hope. This is why initiation rituals were so important. In mystery cults, initiates often symbolically experienced death before rebirth. They might walk through dark rooms. They might fast. They might remain silent for long periods. Darkness was a teacher. Silence was a teacher. Through these rituals, participants learned that death was not the end. They believed the soul could continue. The Eleusinian mysteries promised that those who were initiated would have a better afterlife. This promise gave comfort. Later philosophers spoke about the soul in more rational ways. But before philosophy became dominant, ritual carried the emotional weight of survival. When later generations tried to present Greece as purely rational and logical, these emotional rituals seemed primitive. But they were not primitive. They were responses to fear, and fear is universal. The body is sacred. Modern readers sometimes feel shocked when they read about how the ancient Greeks viewed the body. For them, the human body was not always something to hide. Athletes competed without clothing during the Olympic Games. Sculptors carved detailed statues that celebrated human form. But this openness was not only about art. It also had spiritual meaning. In some rituals, the body itself became part of the sacred experience. Movement, dance, and physical expression were ways to honor the gods. During certain festivals, participants wore masks or special clothing. These costumes allowed them to step outside their daily identity. To wear a mask was to become something else. To dance in rhythm was to join something larger than yourself. In the cult of Dionysus, this physical transformation was intense. Followers believed that through movement and music, they could connect directly with divine power. Later cultures often separated body and spirit. They treated the body as something sinful or weak. But in ancient Greece, the body could be holy. This difference makes some ancient rituals difficult for modern audiences to understand. Love, desire, and sacred bonds. Another complex topic that history often simplifies is the role of love and desire in ancient Greek society. Relationships in ancient Greece were structured differently from modern ideas. Marriage was often arranged for family reasons, but emotional bonds could form in many ways. In some religious and philosophical traditions, close bonds between teacher and student were seen as sacred paths to wisdom. The idea was that love, in different forms, could guide the soul toward truth. Later historians, especially during more conservative periods, tried to reshape or silence these traditions. They preferred a simpler moral story. But ancient Greek culture was layered. It included family duty, romantic desire, mentorship, and spiritual friendship. These bonds sometimes had ritual elements, shared meals, shared study, shared worship, all created emotional intimacy. To erase these realities would be to erase human complexity. Ancient Greece was not morally simple. It was deeply human. Ritual madness and social control. One of the most feared elements of ancient Greek ritual life was controlled madness. This may sound strange, but for the Greeks, madness was not always negative. In certain contexts, madness meant divine inspiration. Poets were said to be touched by the gods. Prophets spoke in altered states. Dionysian followers entered ecstatic trances. But here is the important detail. This madness was usually contained within ritual space. It had rules. It had time limits. It had boundaries. Outside of ritual, society valued self-control and reason. Inside, ritual emotion was allowed to flow. This balance kept society stable. But when outside observers saw these rituals without understanding the rules, they saw chaos. Later, historians sometimes described these practices as wild or dangerous without explaining the structure behind them. This made the rituals seem more frightening than they truly were. The truth is that ancient Greece understood something powerful. People need emotional release. Without it, pressure builds. Ritual provided safe space for that release. The influence of Rome and the changing image of Greece as the Roman Empire grew, Greece became part of a larger political world. Romans admired Greek philosophy and art. They copied Greek statues. They studied Greek literature, but they also judged Greek religion. Some Roman leaders feared secret cults. They believed large private gatherings could threaten political control. In 186 BCE, for example, Roman authorities restricted certain Dionysian gatherings. They claimed these rituals led to crime and conspiracy. Whether this was true or exaggerated, the result was clear. Mystery religions were monitored and limited. When Christianity later spread across the empire, the transformation became even stronger. Christian leaders rejected pagan rituals. Temples were closed. Festivals were replaced. Over time, the official story of Greece changed. The focus shifted to philosophy, logic, democracy, and art. Ritual life faded into the background. This was not always a violent erasure. Sometimes it was gradual. Sometimes it was simple neglect. But the effect was the same. The emotional, intimate side of ancient Greece became less visible. Archaeology and the return of forgotten stories in modern times. Archaeology has helped bring back some of these hidden stories. Excavations at Eleusis revealed the large ritual hall, where thousands once gathered. Artifacts from sanctuaries show symbols of fertility, transformation, and rebirth. Inscriptions revealed names of women who served as priestesses, proof that they held real authority. Slowly, scholars have rebuilt a more complete picture. This picture shows a society that balanced reason with mystery. It shows a culture that used both logic and ritual to understand existence. It also shows that history is never fixed. As new discoveries appear, old assumptions fall. The Greece we learn about in school is only part of the story. Why these rituals still matter, some may ask, why does this matter today? It matters because how we tell history shapes how we see ourselves. If we believe ancient Greece was only about cold logic and marble statues, we miss something important. We miss the emotional depth. We miss the spiritual searching. We miss the courage it took to face death through ritual. We miss the power women held inside sacred spaces. We miss the human need for mystery. These rituals remind us that humans across time share the same questions. Why are we here? What happens after death? How do we handle fear? How do we celebrate life? Ancient Greeks answered these questions in ways that may feel strange today. But strange does not mean meaningless. Closing reflection, the phrase, horrifying, intimate rituals can sound dramatic. But when we look closely, we see something deeper. We see a civilization trying to survive. We see people using symbols, movement, silence, and community to make sense of a dangerous world. Some rituals were intense. Some were secret. Some were misunderstood. But they were not simply darkness. They were attempts to find light. Ancient Greece did not fully erase these rituals. Instead, history slowly pushed them into the shadows. Today, by studying them carefully and respectfully, we bring balance back to the story. The real Greece was not only rational, it was emotional. It was spiritual. It was complex, and perhaps that complexity is what makes it truly human.